So, it's early 2026, and the entire Caribbean is holding its breath. You've got a superpower putting an intense squeeze on its island neighbor, and who's caught right in the middle? Jamaica. They're being forced to make this incredibly high-stakes choice between their history and their very survival. We're talking about a diplomatic tightrope walk, where one wrong move could be absolutely devastating. So let's break down how they got into this impossible situation. To really get a handle on just how serious this is, you have to start right here. This isn't your average political spat. The New York Times is comparing what's happening now to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I mean, literally one of the most dangerous standoffs in history. That's the kind of intensity we're dealing with in 2026. But a crisis like this doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. Nope. This is the result of more than 60 years of hostility, with a few brief moments of calm thrown in. To really understand why Jamaica is in such a tough spot, we've got to go back and look at the decades of history that set the stage. And this timeline, well, it shows you the pattern pretty clearly. It all kicks off in 1959 with the revolution. Then 1962 really locks in the animosity with the embargo. We get this glimpse of hope in 2015, a sign of what could have been, but that gets slammed shut pretty quick. And by 2025, the maximum pressure campaign is back, leading us right to the 2026 oil blockade that lit this whole fire. Which brings us right up to the present day. The U.S. strategy couldn't be clearer. They want to cut off Cuba's economic lifeline. After getting involved in Venezuela and getting rid of Cuba's main oil supplier, Washington has now put a full-on blockade on any oil tanker headed for the island. And it's pushing the entire nation to its absolute breaking point. Yeah, and there's really no hiding what the goal is here. When the President of the United States is openly talking about a friendly takeover, it basically confirms what everyone was already thinking. The whole point of this pressure campaign is to force a regime change in Havana, and to do it fast. For the 11 million people in Cuba, the impact on the ground is just catastrophic. The country has literally been plunged into darkness with these massive power outages. There's no fuel, so public transport is grinding to a halt, factories are going quiet. Food and medicine are getting incredibly scarce. And with airlines canceling flights, the tourism industry, which is so vital, has just collapsed. A lot of people are saying it's even worse than the devastating special period back in the 90s. And this is where Jamaica gets pulled into the storm. As Cuba's closest neighbor, it's in a nearly impossible spot. It's caught between a friend of decades who is in a deep crisis and, well, an indispensable superpower that is demanding total loyalty. And this chart just lays out the dilemma perfectly. On one side, you have Jamaica's complete and total dependence on the U.S. for trade, investment, security. I mean, the U.S. calls Jamaica its most like-minded partner in the region. But on the other side, you have a half-century of really deep ties with Cuba, especially that famous medical program that sent doctors and nurses to Jamaican hospitals, plus that shared Caribbean identity. It's a real balancing act. Okay, look at this number, $3.5 billion. Let that just sink in for a second. That's the money sent home by Jamaicans living abroad in 2025. It makes up over 15% of the country's entire GDP. So this is not just a statistic, it's the absolute lifeblood of the economy, and it's Washington's single biggest point of leverage. So, facing all this immense pressure, Jamaica made a truly seismic decision. In March, it just ended the Cuban medical program, a program that had been a cornerstone of their relationship with Havana for 50 years. Gone. This one move signaled a massive shift in their entire foreign policy. So how did they explain it? Well, you get two totally different stories. The Jamaican government says, hey, this was a legal and administrative thing. We just had to align the program with our labor laws. But Cuba was blunt. They called it what they saw it as, a capitulation. They said Jamaica simply yielded to pressure from the United States. So how in the world does Jamaica justify such a huge shift? Well, they've actually come up with a whole new foreign policy doctrine to try and navigate this incredibly dangerous new reality. They're calling it principled realism. And what is principled realism? Well, at its heart, it's a strategy for survival. It's an attempt to hang on to traditional principles, like solidarity, while also accepting a very harsh truth. Every single decision has to be viewed through the cold, hard lens of Jamaica's own national survival. And here's how it plays out in practice. It seems to have three key parts. First, you keep up the symbolic support, right? You keep voting against the U.S. embargo at the UN. Step two, you start tying your support for Cuba to calls for them to change internally. Democratic reforms, more open markets, things that sound a lot like what the U.S. wants. And third, and this is the really clever bit, you justify the really tough choices, like ending that medical program, by saying it's just a domestic legal issue. It gives you cover from accusations of caving to foreign pressure. You know, this whole situation really zooms out to a much bigger question. Jamaica's story isn't just about Jamaica. It's the classic struggle of any small state trying to stay independent when it's caught between geopolitical giants. What we're seeing here is a potential playbook for how to survive in an increasingly polarized world. And this quote right here, it perfectly explains the realism part of their strategy. Prime Minister Andrew Holness is basically saying, look, chaos in Cuba is not going to stay in Cuba. If that state collapses just 90 miles away, it means a potential wave of migration, a security crisis, and that would spill right over and threaten the entire region, especially Jamaica. So this isn't just foreign policy anymore. For them, it's homeland security. So you might be asking, why not just stand up to the US and stand by Cuba? Well, this slide spells out exactly why. The potential consequences are frankly terrifying. We're talking visa sanctions for their leaders, crippling trade tariffs, and cutting security aid that's actually helped bring their murder rate down. But the real killer? Any disruption to that $3.5 billion in remittances. That could trigger immediate financial chaos for the whole country. The risks of defiance are, well, they're almost existential. Which brings us to our final, really critical question. For a small island nation facing this kind of overwhelming pressure, is a delicate, pragmatic, and sometimes painful balancing act like principled realism the only real way forward? Or is it actually a step away from sovereignty itself? That is a dilemma with absolutely no easy answers.